Welcome to my thoughts and opinions on the Cold War. And like I said before, these are things that I just learned recently. Many of them I thought I knew about the Cold War. I actually studied it in college and took classes, and I've read books before. But there's a history that we're given. There's a narrative that is passed on to us through the government and academia. And then when you start digging and digging under, look, turning over rocks, you start finding things out. And I'm not talking about conspiracy theories. I'm talking about reading what the people involved said about what they believed and themselves and what they were doing. You start to get a different picture often. So once again, I'm not talking about a conspiracy theory. I'm talking about what I'm reading, what people who participated in the events said about themselves and their participation. So let's get remember, we can ascribe many beginnings to the Cold War. It's usually prescribed after Churchill's speech calling referring to an Iron Curtain in 1946, or maybe the Berlin airlift, 47 or 48. But it goes back beyond that. I think from the time Stalin uh, of Russia, Soviet Russia, was trying to infiltrate and corrupt and pervert the government and culture of the United States, particularly we could start with when FDR acknowledged the Soviet Union. There was a distinct effort to destroy or undermine America. It's kind of funny because, Stalin was all about socialism in one country, and he hated Trotsky, who was all about an immediate international revolution. But yet, Stalin did try to undercut us and to infiltrate us. He had a communist party in America that was doing his will, and eventually the Democratic Party would do the will of the communists, but without a country to hinge its actions on other than the U.S. So, in any event, before I talk about what I want to talk about today, I want to bring the point. Understand that in the Stalin was dead, and in the 50s, Soviet Russia's invasion of Hungary and some things that they did really discouraged American communists, and they began to look elsewhere. The worker wasn't wanting to rebel. Yes, unions were corrupt and a lot of bad things there, but the workers in America, which was Marxist oppressed class, they didn't want to rebel. And so the focus began to change to who were the proletariat. Now, the proletariat, that word proletariat comes from the Roman Empire. These were soldiers who didn't meet the property qualifications for certain aspects of the army. And I believe it was Manlius or Marius it might have been Manlius. I have to look it up. In like 100 BC, he incorporated proletariat, gave them more responsibility and opportunities than they had before. So they were the bottom rung. So the proletariat in Marxist and communist theory is the oppressed class. So the workers failing the American communists and Soviet Russia failing the American communists, they began to look at marginalized groups as the proletariat. So you have you had feminism, women who were not happy with traditional roles. You had homosexuality, they had been oppressed by laws against them. Eventually, you would have transgender, whether it's from the days of Christine Jorgensen, back when that was a shock, to now, where it's accelerating. You also had radical environmentalism. Environmentalism, not just we need to stop pollution so we can breathe and our kids can breathe, but a radical environmentalism for government control. And then civil rights. You had two kinds of civil rights actors. You have people like Martin Luther King, whatever you think about him personally, Martin Luther King, who expresses that he longed for a country where people were judged by the character, not by the color of their skin, the quality of their character, rather than the color of their skin. That's one type of civil rights thought. But then the Marxist thought is no, character is not important, and that the minority becomes part of the new proletariat. So we have the new proletariat, the workers have been abandoned, American communism, American Marxism. You have now the new proletariat is the feminist the gay, homosexual, transgender, uh, black civil rights, minority civil rights, and radical environmentalism. Now, one of the goals of Marxism, is the dictatorship of the proletariat. So you have to understand that this is never about just giving somebody equal rights. The goal here is the absolute domination of the bourgeoisie, the oppressor class, which is white people or anybody among the proletariat who believes in values and principles of our country's founding, like self-reliance as much as you can, working hard, saving, family, moral behavior, religion. If you believe in all that, then you lose your ranking in the proletariat and you're now part of the bourgeoisie. Or as what some communist news commentators and politicians say, so and so, some black leader is the black face of white supremacy, because they ascribe to traditional values. And so and you have to understand that they'll take the language. You can't, and I'll explain that in a second, an aspect of that in a second. But anyway, so this change and the new proletariat becoming marginalized groups and the environment, radical environmentalism for government control, became the new left, and the new left was considered to be inspired by and based on the writings of Herbert Marcuse, who some people say gave us the slogan, "Remember, make love, not war," the Vietnam War. He also wrote several books, Philosophical Inquiry into Freud, Eros and Civilization, and One Dimensional Man, which are very hard to read. But I'll give you an example here. In Eros and Civilization, he talks about the value of sexual perversion, what's considered perversion. He talks about the value of it. And one of the things he says is the perversions thus express rebellion against the subjugation of sexuality under the order of procreation and against the institutions which guarantee this order. And he goes on to explain the value of expressing yourself, and that all sexual expression is equally good. So, whether and you look at Michel Foucault, his history of sexuality, it goes from whatever you want to do all the way to pedophilia. I mean, that's what the ultimate expression of this Marxism is. So you have to understand that. And also the dictatorship of the proletariat involves the destruction of the family, the erasing of the authority in the family, so that the parents do not have control of the children, that the state has control over the children, and that the parents' rights and the parents' responsibilities are diminished, and those responsibilities taken over by the state. So you have to understand where things are going in this current climate we're in now. When you see lawlessness and people getting away with crimes and being released, the proletariat cannot commit a crime against the bourgeoisie. The proletariat is entitled to if you're a bourgeoisie, that means if you're any white person who doesn't go along, or if you're a black person or a Latino or any Asian who believes in hard work and sacrifice and things like that, religion, family. If you move over into the bourgeoisie thinking, then you're one of them too. Okay, so it's not a color thing that way. But so they cannot commit a crime against the bourgeoisie because they're entitled to everything the bourgeoisie has. The bourgeoisie, just by their existence, is an oppressor and has stolen everything from the proletariat. So the proletariat is entitled to it. So just keep that in mind when you go, why are they not arresting? Why don't they want to arrest criminals and keep them locked up? Well, because they're entitled to do what they're doing. And you're not entitled to even defend yourself. If you're white, black, and you're a hardworking person and you have property and you work hard for your family and you have faith, you're not entitled to keep your stuff that you worked for because you're part of the bourgeoisie. So I'm simplifying it, oversimplifying it, but so when you see this stuff in the radical environmentalism, climate change is used to, the idea is a global, and it winds up being communist collective government, dictatorship of the proletariat. And we talk about democracy, it's democracy by proxy. We have an elite that rules and everybody else just votes to rubber stamp what they did. So it's important. Regarding the 30s, I want to point out a really good book, "The Red Decade" by Eugene Lyons, who was a communist sympathizer. Talks about the Soviet penetration, the Stalinist penetration of the American culture and government in the 30s. The great thing about this book, as opposed to other books I've read, is that he names names. The people that signed off on letters that supporting communism and things like that. He names the names, so you can follow some of these people who through the decades by simply looking them up on the internet. There's a list of names. You've got actors and academians, academics, and politicians and stuff like that. So you start looking for those. Now, one thing I want to point out is that we too often allow the left, the communists, to control the narrative. So right now, as an example, one of the things you'll hear communists and Marxists talk about how the phrase cultural Marxism or neo-Marxism is a right-wing, white supremacist conspiracy term that has no meaning, that we invented, but that's a lie. Here's a book from 1973, a Marxist book called The Critique of Domination by Trent Schroyer. And in this book, he coins the phrases cultural Marxism and neo-Marxism. Now, this is 1973. This is not a white supremacist. This is not a capitalist. Um, Here it is in chapter 6, cultural Marxism. I don't know if you can read that. Cultural Marxism, the contradictions of industrial rationality. And he also coins the phrase neo-Marxism and stuff like that. So, when they say that, when you see that in Wikipedia, or when you see a British member of Parliament talking about cultural Marxism, is just a phrase that the right wing uses or invented, they're lying. They're just lying. They control the narrative. They will take any word, you want to use that you use. It's verbal appropriation. For instance, as an example, in today's world, a thug has always been somebody who was simply a criminal or brutal or somebody, an unsavory character. Well, if you use the word thug now, there'll be people that'll say, "Oh, you're racist," because they will ascribe thug to inner city black life, black culture. So they will appropriate the word. I don't have to go along with that. Okay, I'll still use thug the traditional way it was used. Same with gay. I refer to homosexuals. They appropriated the word gay, which once meant happy or bright or joyous. They'll appropriate that to describe them. You don't have to go along with that. You know, you can have homosexual friends and not go along with that. You don't have to be against them or hate them to go along, not to go along with that. So you don't have to let people appropriate words. And unfortunately, the right wing does it too. But so just keep that in mind. Now, I want to talk to you about a warning that we were given by General Macarthur. Um, and this was this was actually a warning about a creeping revolution that he saw happening. And he was gave a speech in Jackson, Mississippi. It's March 22nd, 1952. And part of the text of the speech that I pulled from a couple of books here, it becomes increasingly clear that the pattern of American fiscal policy is being brought into consonance with the Karl Marx communist theory that through a division of the existing wealth, mankind will be brought to a universal standard of life, a degree of mediocrity to which the communists and their fellow travelers seek to reduce the people of this great nation. Whether it be by action or design, such policy, formulated with reckless indifference to the preservation of constitutional liberty and our free enterprise economy, coupled with rapid centralization of power in the hands of a few, is leading us toward a communist state with this dreadful certainty, as though the leaders of the Kremlin themselves were charting our course. Then in another speech, he said, quote, "Talk of imminent threat to our national security through the application of external force is pure nonsense. Indeed, it is part of the general pattern of misguided policy that our country is now geared to an arms economy which was bred in an artificially induced psychosis of war hysteria and nurtured upon an incessant propaganda of fear. While such an economy may produce a sense of seeming prosperity for the moment, it rests on an illusionary foundation of complete unreliability and renders our political leaders almost a greater fear of peace than is their fear of war." So these are charges made by, at the time, the nation's most distinguished military leader, and they're pretty shocking. Um, Now, it wasn't that he was solely motivated by resentment against President Truman, who had removed him from command in the Far East, but his view of the use of the Cold War to promote revolutionary objectives is acknowledged by a leading Marxist theoretician. There was an essay in the Nation of New York on December 16th, 1950, and Richard Crossman, Labor Party member of the British Parliament and assistant editor of the Socialist New Statesman and Nation, declared, quote, "We are coming to realize in Britain that the Cold War is not merely an unfortunate mishap caused by mistakes of diplomacy on both sides or a struggle between rival imperialisms. Essentially, it is a struggle of ideas in which the free enterprise is not the protagonist on the Western side, but the chief obstacle to our victory. Every American action which has been successful in resisting communism has been carried out in defiance of the principles which actuate American business. Marshall aid became a magnificent, if involuntary, precedent for international cooperation because the Americans who ran it applied to European recovery methods of social planning, which are anathema to most businessmen. And if our military defenses are adequately strengthened, this will only be done by once again violating every principle of competitive free enterprise in capitalist economics. The Cold War is, in fact, is not only a menace, but a creative force. If the fair dealer and the socialists understand their job, the Cold War will enable us to reconstruct the non-communist world in a way that would have been totally impossible had the Russians been willing to work with us peacefully in 1945. Russian collaboration at that time was certainly precipitated a world slump and removed any possibility of the American aid, which has provided so many of the physical resources for the British socialist experiment. So, and even the writings of the late dictator Stalin made it clear that Soviet strategy was did contemplate the use of military force to overthrow the American bastion of capitalism, but only after a revolutionary crisis had developed in our country. The Kremlin hoped to develop world revolution by communist subversive activity in non-communist countries, by applying pressure around the 25,000-mile periphery of the Soviet Union and inducing the United States to dissipate its resources to spend itself into bankruptcy. And in the quote, "The Problems of Leninism," millions of copies of that were distributed throughout the Soviet Union. Stalin said the victorious proletariat of Russia should raise revolts against the capitalists of other countries. They even come out with armed force and of necessity. So the primary emphasis is on revolutionary activity. So that was his goal. Armed force to be used in a struggle with the United States only if it was necessary. Um, and he addressed the American Commission of the Executive Committee of the Communist International on May 6, 1929. Stalin declared, when a revolutionary crisis develops in America, that would be the beginning of the end of world capitalism as a whole. So Stalin was bent on corrupting our country, our culture, and as I'm going to get into this, talking more and more about the corruption of our government in the 30s and during World War II. It's just absolutely astounding, and I'm just not going to do it justice. So I hope that you'll listen to some things I say. I'll try not to go on too long. Maybe next time I won't go as long as it is time, but hopefully, I'll be able to show you what I'm seeing, and I hope that makes sense to you. And anyway, just pray for America, because we're at a very, very crucial crossroads. It can't be solved by violence. It can't be solved by adopting the tactics of the other side. We have got to use what resources we have left, what powers we have left politically, to hold back the tide, a growing tide of collectivism, of left-wing collectivism, of communism. That's just when you have politicians sitting in the halls of Congress who will say that such things as self-reliance, hard work, faith are emblems of white supremacy. When you have people like Marcuse taught this, that free speech is a token of oppression, that people should not be allowed to speak, to say their mind, that they should be forced into what they should say. When you see parents demonized who are trying to be involved in their children's education, and you see them being demonized. When you see Antifa, a communist group, a bunch of thugs attacking parents in the street. When you see that, you realize how we are on the edge of something and it has to be resisted. But I want to get back to the Cold War early on. There's a lot of things that took place back then that led us to this point we're at now. So when I say fight the good fight, I don't mean violence, okay? I mean there are ways we still have to oppose this flood. Um, it's evil. It's incredibly evil. Um, I have nothing bad to say, or I don't want to hurt anybody who's experiencing confusion about who they are, or who's struggling economically, or who feels like their world's stacked against them. I understand, I empathize with that. But I'm talking about the theoreticians, the people that are running the show and trying to control all of us. Um, Let me just say one thing, last thing. It's traditional in communist takeovers of countries throughout history. The idealistic people who were the vanguard, who were the revolutionaries, who spoke out, who were the intellectuals, the people that were in the newspaper, the people that were in the streets, the people that were protesting the old regimes. Um, those people, once the actual communists take over, the dictators, the dominant people, the strong men, once they take over, those are the first people they kill. So you're being used. If you're promoting this because you are gay, or you're transgender, or you're a feminist, or you're worried about the environment, um, or you're civil, you don't believe that you believe America's a racist nation. If you're promoting this because of that, understand that when the real bad guys take over, you'll be the first ones they come for. I'm just telling you, it's always been that way. So be warned.